This is the first lecture for chapter 14. Remember, we are skipping chapter 13, which is on spectroscopy. Most of you did that last semester in the lab, but we'll cover that later on anyhow, or we'll do it again. But in today's lecture, on chapter 14, we'll concentrate on free radical substitution. So the reaction type that we will be looking at is substitution reaction, and we'll further define this as free radical substitution. So in this introductory part of the chapter, we'll look at types of alkanes and alkyl halides. We'll look at the relative stabilities of radicals. We'll next examine the mechanism for free radical chlorination of alkanes, or the substitution of hydrogen for chlorine in alkanes. And lastly, we'll look at the examples of free radical chlorination of alkanes. Okay, so let us begin. The hydrogens of hydrocarbons can be classified based on the number of carbons or hydrogens that are bonded to a particular carbon. Okay, let me state that differently. So we're looking at hydrocarbons. Remember, this is organic chemistry, so it's the study of chemistry of compounds that contain carbon and hydrogen primarily, but also heteroatoms. But now we're looking at alkanes, and alkanes are one category of hydrocarbons. Alkanes contain carbons that contain only single bonds to it. Okay, so there are 4 bonds to a carbon that's part of an alkane. There are 4 bonds to that carbon. So we can classify the hydrogen and the carbon based on the structure. Remember that there are million different isomers that are possible for hydrocarbons. So let's look at the simplest one, which is CH4. This only has 1 carbon and 4 hydrogens. So this carbon is described as a methyl carbon because it's from methane. And these 4 hydrogens here are described as methyl hydrogens. Another classification is, so here is a carbon that's bonded to 1 alkyl group, only 1. So this is called a primary carbon because it's bonded to 1 alkyl group. The hydrogens that are bonded to this carbon are called primary hydrogens. Primary hydrogens are bonded to primary carbons. As you can imagine, here is a carbon that has 1 and 2 carbon containing alkyl groups. 2, so therefore it's a secondary carbon. And the hydrogens that are bonded to a secondary carbon are called secondary hydrogens. And lastly, as you can imagine, here's a carbon that's bonded to 1, 2, and 3 alkyl groups, and that carbon is called a tertiary carbon. And since there are 4 bonds to a carbon of an alkane, the hydrogen that's bonded is called a tertiary hydrogen. So this gives you the classification of alkanes. So let us apply that knowledge to a molecule. So here's a molecule, CH3, CH2, CH3. It has different types of carbons, and it also has different types of hydrogens, which we can describe as either primary, secondary, or tertiary. So if you're asked what type hydrogen is this, you look at the carbon that it's bonded to. This carbon is bonded to one other carbon, so therefore these hydrogens are called a primary hydrogens or primary hydrogens. This hydrogen here is bonded to a carbon that's bonded to one and two other carbons, so therefore this carbon is a secondary carbon, and the hydrogens that are bonded to that carbon are called secondary hydrogens. So you should be able to classify the hydrogens of a alkane as primary, secondary, or tertiary. Here's an example. So we have here carbon. So this hydrogen here is a tertiary. And these hydrogens here are all methyl. So that is the classification of the hydrogens and carbons of isobutane. We can do a similar classification for chlorides or halogens, halogenated compounds. As you can imagine, here's a carbon, and of interest is a chlorine. So it's a chloride, but more specifically, it's bonded to a methyl carbon because it's only one carbon, so it's a methyl chloride. Here's another chloride, but it's bonded to a carbon that's bonded to one other carbon, so therefore it's a primary chloride. And likewise, this is a chloride because it's here, and this carbon is bonded to two other carbons, so it's a secondary carbon, so therefore this entire molecule here is a secondary chloride. Lastly, as you can imagine, here's a chloride, and it's bonded to a carbon that has 1, 2, and 3 carbons, in this case a methyl group, so therefore this entire molecule here is a tertiary chloride. Let's look at another example here. So here is a carbon of interest. It is bonded to one other carbon and 3 hydrogens. So you would think that it's a primary. However, this carbon here is not a saturated carbon. It's a double bond. So this carbon here is different from that carbon of a saturated R group. And because this is a double bond here, this carbon here is called an allylic carbon. You'll see later on this group here is called vinyl. But this carbon that's adjacent to the carbon-carbon double bond is called the allylic carbon. So therefore these hydrogens here are the allylic hydrogens. Here's another special case. This carbon is bonded to another carbon. So you would intuitively think that it is a methyl carbon. But this carbon here is different from your alkyl carbon. It's bonded to the carbon of a benzene ring. So therefore this carbon is called a benzylic carbon. And of course these hydrogens here are called the benzylic hydrogen. So look out for these terms. Of course, as you know, in chemistry we have developed terms over years, and we communicate with each other using these terms. So don't let these terms confuse you. So here is a chloride because it's a chlorine, and it's bonded to a carbon that's bonded to a vinyl or carbon-carbon double bond. So therefore it is an allylic chloride because of this carbon here being an allylic carbon. Here's a chloride, but it's bonded to here a carbon of a benzene ring. So therefore this carbon here is a benzylic carbon, making this entire molecule a benzylic chloride. Alright, so let's see if we can apply that to solving some problems here. Classify the indicated hydrogens, there should be an S here, I'll correct that, as methyl, primary, secondary, tertiary, allylic, or benzylic. So here's a hydrogen of interest. It's bonded to a carbon, and then you will have to determine if that carbon is a secondary carbon, because it's bonded to a carbon here and a carbon here, but it's bonded here to a benzene ring. So it could be a secondary carbon, or it could be a benzylic carbon. We will see. Here's another hydrogen that's bonded to a carbon that has 1, 2, and 3 groups. Here's a carbon that's bonded to a hydrogen that's bonded to a carbon that's bonded to 1 alkyl group, because it has 2 hydrogens here. Here is a hydrogen that's bonded to a carbon, but notice again, this carbon is bonded to a carbon that has the double bond. It's also bonded to another carbon. So what takes priority? Secondary, or is it an allylic? Here's a hydrogen bonded to a carbon that's bonded to 1, 2, and 3 alkyl groups. And lastly, here is a hydrogen that's bonded to a carbon that has 1, 2 carbon containing alkyl groups. So let's see what's the solution. So this is called a benzylic, because this takes priority over the secondary. This hydrogen is a tertiary because 1, 2, and 3 alkyl groups. This hydrogen here is a primary because all of this group here is 1 alkyl group bonded to that carbon. Here is a hydrogen bonded to a carbon, but it's bonded to a double bonded carbon and another carbon. This group takes priority because it's a carbon-carbon double bond, so therefore it is an allylic hydrogen. Here is a hydrogen that's bonded to a carbon that has 1, 2, and 3 groups, so therefore tertiary. And as you can see here, this hydrogen is bonded to this carbon, which is bonded to 1 and 2 other carbons, so therefore secondary. Notice the difference between this and this molecule. So this hydrogen here is allylic, and this hydrogen here is secondary. Let us now apply that knowledge to the breakage of a bond. Let's see the importance of what we just discussed. So the homolytic cleavage of a carbon-hydrogen bond. Homolytic here means the breakage of a carbon bond, a carbon-hydrogen in this case, which has 2 electrons. So it's a homolytic cleavage. So 1 electron will go to the hydrogen, and the other electron will go to the carbon. Okay, the bottom line is, a weak bond produces a stable radical. A weak bond produces a stable radical and requires less energy to break compared to a strong bond, which requires more energy and produces a less stable radical. So let's look at this down here. So here we have an allylic carbon right here. Why allylic? Because of this carbon-oxygen, carbon-carbon double bond. Here's the bond of interest right here. We're looking for a homolytic cleavage. So here's a single barbed arrow to push the electron, one electron to hydrogen. Here it is. And a single barbed arrow to push the other electron off this covalent bond onto carbon, and here it is. So this, what's produced, is a radical. More specifically, since this carbon is bonded to a double bond, it's called an allylic radical. So now you can see the importance of these terms before. Let's look at this other molecule. This is a secondary hydrogen. So if we break this bond in a homolytic cleavage, where one electron goes onto the carbon and the other electron goes onto hydrogen, we have produced here a hydrogen radical, but we have also produced here a radical that's now a secondary radical. Notice a secondary radical because this carbon is bonded to 1 and 2 alkyl groups. Notice the energy that's required to break these bonds. This bond requires more energy than breaking this bond. So breaking this bond requires 95 kcals per mole, and breaking this bond requires 89 kcals per mole less. What we have produced here is a radical that's stable. So the weaker bond here, weak because it requires less energy, produces a stable radical, and the stronger bond here produces a less stable radical because it requires more energy to break. Okay, let's take this further. We can illustrate that concept using a figure. As we have done in chemistry, we use figures quite a lot to communicate different concepts. So we're starting out here with a hydrocarbon. It takes more energy to produce the secondary radical, and it takes less energy to break that bond to produce the more stable radical. Just to refresh your memory, remember anything that's lower in energy here is considered stable, and anything that's higher in energy here is considered less stable. All right, let's see why though. Why is the allylic radical stable? Why is the allylic radical stable compared to the secondary radical? So here is an example of the allylic radical. So we have one electron here in that p orbital. Remember this electron, this carbon here is sp2 hybridized with a p orbital that's unhybridized and contains the odd electron. So, as you know from resonance, we can delocalize this odd electron over to this carbon. So in other words, this odd electron is constantly moving with the adjacent 2 electrons of the double bond. Whenever an electron can delocalize or move across carbons, it presents stability to that radical, or to that intermediate. So the allylic radical is stable because the odd electron here can be delocalized over these 3 atoms. More stability. We'll see later on that is not the case with a secondary radical. The benzylic also, here's the benzylic carbon, and here's the benzylic radical. That odd electron in that p orbital of the sp2 carbon that's here, this odd electron can be delocalized throughout the ring or throughout the adjacent pi structure. So to illustrate that, we use arrows, and as you can see here, this electron can move in, these electrons can move here to form this double bond, and one of these electrons go here. So you can see we can put this odd electron here, we can put it here, we can put it here, which means that that odd electron has been delocalized throughout the benzene ring, and that presents stability to the radical. So that is why the benzylic radical and the allylic radical are exceptionally stable radicals. On the other hand, however, let's look at the methyl radical. Here's the sp2 carbon. Here is the unhybridized p orbital with one electron. You can see here that there are no adjacent orbitals for this odd electron to be delocalized into. So we describe this as a localized charge. So if a localized electron, pardon me. So if we have a localized electron that cannot move, it's considered not very stable compared to another system where the electron can be delocalized. Let's look at a primary radical. So here's a carbon, sp2 carbon again, primary, so it's bonded to one other carbon here, and of course two hydrogens. Notice the geometry carefully though. This hydrogen, that hydrogen, and this CC bond are in the same plane that's perpendicular to this p orbital. However, if this carbon here has another alkyl group or even a hydrogen, these bonding electrons here, these covalent bonding electrons, are sitting right across from this odd electron. So those bonding electrons will have an influence on the stability of this odd electron. So this primary radical is a bit more stable than your methyl radical because of the possibility of these single bonded electrons or two electrons being adjacent or next to, right beside the p orbital that has just one electron. As you can imagine, if we now have here a secondary radical, so here's a secondary radical, the carbon is here, the radical is here, we now have two groups and one hydrogen sitting in the plane that's perpendicular, but it's possible to have here a carbon hydrogen or carbon bond that's adjacent to the p orbital. Same here. So now we have two sets of electrons that can help stabilize this one electron. So that's why here a secondary radical will be more stable than a primary radical, because we have two sets of electrons that are adjacent or sitting next to or right beside the p orbital that can help stabilize that odd electron. As you can imagine, a tertiary will now have 1, 2, and 3 groups sitting right next to it. So those electrons, or those bonding electrons, they can help stabilize that odd electron in the radical. So conclusion is, you can see here that your methyl radical is the least stable. Notice stability is going in this direction. So that's the least stable radical. And over here, the tertiary radical is the most stable. So once again, whenever you visualize these drawings, you should visualize it in 3 dimensions, where the electrons adjacent to the radical can help stabilize that odd electron in the p orbital. This, as we mentioned, is extremely stable. So the allylic and the benzylic they are the most stable radical, and the least stable radical is your methyl radical. So this is a trend for the stability of radicals. This is going to be very important when we start looking at reactions and the stability of intermediates and predicting products. So once again, the methyl radical is the least stable, and the most stable will be your benzylic and allylic, and of course your tertiary is next. So let us apply this knowledge here to solving this problem. So of the pairs of radicals shown below, determine which is more stable. Here we have this radical and this radical. Notice it's a radical because it's one electron sitting on this carbon, one electron sitting on this carbon. So which is more stable? So what you'll have to do here is to determine if this carbon is primary, secondary, tertiary, which will tell us if the radical is primary, secondary, tertiary. So this carbon is bonded to two other carbons and a hydrogen, so therefore it's a secondary. This is bonded to one, so therefore it's a primary. So now what you'll have to do is to apply your knowledge of stability of radicals to determine which of these two radicals is the most stable. Let's look at this one. This is a carbon that contains the radical, but it's bonded to a double bond. This is bonded to a methyl group. So this is definitely not your methyl radical because of this group here, but it's a allylic, whereas this one is a primary. So you have to exercise extreme care in your observation and analysis of the different types of radicals. Here's another one, tertiary, and here's another one. This looks like it is primary, but it's not because it's bonded to your double bond. So that's allylic, whereas this one here is tertiary. This one here is bonded to the benzene ring, so that's benzylic, and this is of course tertiary. So what you'll have to do here is to apply the knowledge that we have learned, or the concept we have learned on the previous few slides, to solving this problem. So the answer is essentially the secondary is more stable. This is the allylic, which is more stable. This is the allylic, which is more stable. And this is the benzylic, again, which is more stable. So again, you should exercise extreme care in making your observation, and you should be able to apply the concepts that we've covered in the previous couple of slides to solving problems that you have never seen before. Let us now look at reactions. So free radical halogenation of alkanes. These reactions will bring all the concepts that we've covered before in terms of stability of radicals and type hydrogens, etc. So let's look at this. We've covered this reaction here in a previous chapter. This is a substitution where we have substituted H for chlorine. So here it is, substitution, and we have this as the organic product and that as the inorganic product. Another example, cyclohexane, hydrocarbon, an alkane reacting with chlorine. We have a substitution reaction. So we'll take off one of the hydrogens here. Notice there are two hydrogens here. We'll substitute one for chlorine. So now we have chlorine and of course HCl. So this is chlorocyclohexane. So of course, as you know, the reaction just does not magically occur. We'll have to look at the mechanism. What is the mechanism? Remember, the mechanism here is a step-by-step description of a reaction. So once we understand the different steps of a reaction, we can better predict what type product to expect. Sometimes we get unexpected product, as we have seen before, but knowing the mechanism, we can better understand why we have expected products and why sometimes we have unexpected products. So let's look at the mechanism for the free radical halogenation, in this case chlorination. So we start off with chlorine. So if you mix chlorine and methane in a bottle and supply energy in the form of heat or light, so that's energy. It could be either one, heat or light. That's energy. It will break the weakest bond. It turns out that the chlorine-chlorine bond is the weakest bond compared to carbon-hydrogen bond here. So because this bond here is weak and this bond here is strong, energy will break this bond here homolytically. Remember, that's a homolytic cleavage because the electronegativity of these two atoms are the same, so they'll pull one electron into each atom. So now we have Cl dot and Cl dot chlorine radicals. That step, by the way, is called an initiation step. That's how the reaction starts. As you can imagine, chlorine radical is very reactive. So it will abstract a hydrogen atom. Notice, hydrogen atom with one electron to form HCl. So it forms here HCl, where we have one electron from this bond, and what's left behind is a methyl radical, a radical. So you can see here where we're going with this. As part of the reaction mechanism, a radical is produced. And as you can imagine here, based on the type reactant, we have different types of radicals. But in this case, since we're talking about methane, it's a methyl radical. Very reactive, not stable. So because it's very reactive, not stable, it will react with your chlorine here, one chlorine here from this bond to form CH3Cl and leaving behind a chlorine dot. These two steps are called propagation step. Why propagation? Because we have generated or propagated more radicals. Propagation, the generation of more radicals. In the termination step, the radical completes, react together to form a neutral molecule. We have here the methyl radical, very reactive. We also have present a Cl dot radical. So they combine here to form this bond. So remember, there are two electrons in a bond, in a single bond. So we have one electron here from the methyl radical, and we have one electron here from the chloride radical. So forming this bond. And that's called the termination step. So this is the mechanism for the chlorination of methane. So once again, energy supplied, it breaks the weakest bond. The weakest bond here is the halogen bond. In this case, chlorine bond to produce radicals. This radical, being very reactive, abstracts a hydrogen with one electron to form HCl, leaving behind a methyl radical. This methyl radical, of course, as you know, it's not stable, so it reacts here with the chlorine to form CH3Cl, one of the products, but it generates another radical in a propagation step. And of course, in a termination step, we have the two radicals combining to form chloromethane, the product. In our last slide here, let's look at this reaction. So we have here propane. Notice for propane we have two types of CH bonds. We have here the primary CH bond, because this is a primary hydrogen. It's a strong bond because it takes more energy to break this bond. But we also have here the secondary carbon, which is bonded to a hydrogen. So therefore this bond here is weaker because the homolytic cleavage will produce a secondary radical. What I want to point out here though, before we conclude, is that the reaction with chlorine in the presence of energy, in this case heat, we form different radicals. It's part of the mechanism. We form the primary radical and we form the secondary radical. But look at the distribution of products. Of course, I hope you recognize there are two possible products here, because you can substitute this hydrogen or one of these hydrogens here to get two different products. So, but notice the distribution. This is 55% this product, 2-chloropropane, and slightly less, 45% is 1-chloropropane. We'll look at the mechanism in more details in the next lecture, but you should start putting together the pieces. This bond is strong, so we get less of it. This bond is weak, so we get more of it. The radical generated here is more stable. We get more of that. The radical generated right here is less stable, a primary radical. So we get less of that product. So we'll cover that in the next lecture. I think this is the last slide. Yes, it is. So continue. Remember, use these slides or these PowerPoints just to supplement reading the material in the textbook, which has more details provided. This is just a supplement. So work those problems. Look out for the tutorial. I'll put that out this week, and work those through. And remember, we have a quiz on Thursday, which is January 28th. So the material from this lecture and the previous two lectures will be on that quiz. So continue to study hard, work the problems, and you should be okay. Okay? Bye.